Okay, here's the problem. I had only a few days to write a 10,000 word story, and I was given a prompt, and that was it. I had to figure out how to get that story written and write it to professional standards so that it could be read by an editor. And I managed to do it by trusting the process and by synthesizing so much of what had come before. Welcome to the INRIS Files, thoughts on culture, history, and human nature from a Generation X point of view. I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of one way to write a story really is universal. It doesn't matter necessarily what generation you happen to be. There are some principles that always hold. And one of them has to do with something people who work in data analytics are familiar, and that is they're familiar with this idea of garbage in, garbage out. Writing is like any form of storytelling, whether you're writing a song or you're writing a short story or a novel or a script, any kind of short story ultimately comes down to following certain structures and then assembling core elements together in a way that essentially moves a character through a series of incidents or challenges. Think of this as well. Tell you what. Let's step back for a second. I was in a story writing masterclass many years ago where we had been given an assignment before coming into the class. I've mentioned this once before, where we had been given an assignment of turning in some of our writing, but we had also been assigned to read 17 books. We had a few months to read them, but we did have to read them. Of those 17 books, one was nonfiction. Two were collections of the year's best short stories. So one was the year's best mystery and crime stories, and the other was the year's best science fiction stories. And both of these were from the most recent year. The rest were all novels, and they were novels all from different genres. We had a very well-known author writing in romance. We had another very well-known author writing in horror. We had science fiction, we had fantasy, we had suspense, and we had crime, two different genres. Um, just a whole bunch of novels, and I had read some of them. I'm a big fan of Stephen King. I had already read the Stephen King book that was on the list. There are others I haven't read before, but I found them to be a very easy read. There was a Clive Cussler, there was a Lawrence Block, and then there were some authors who wrote in genres that I've never really spent any time in up until that point. For example, Nora Roberts, who is a very widely recognized author in romance. She's also recognized in science fiction, but she writes under a different name in science fiction. She writes as J.D. Robb. I can't remember the example of the science fiction novel that we read for that year, but again, it was one I was familiar with. And so even though I had already read a few, that meant, oh, okay, now I only have to read 10 or 12 books in the span of a few months. I really had to cram to get that in. And don't tell Chris and Dean, but I didn't read all of the stories in the short stories collections, but I did read a lot of them. I say collections, I meant anthologies. There's a distinction. Collections are a group of stories that are all written by one author. Anthologies are a group of stories that are written by multiple authors. Not something we need to worry about here, but anyway, I mention it. So This had been the assignment. Read these books. The nonfiction book was a history of the New York Times bestseller list in the 20th century. So it essentially, every chapter covered one decade, and it worked all the way through the 20th century. And it was genuinely fascinating to see how the trends shifted over time in terms of what were the most popular books, both fiction and nonfiction. So, having read all of that coming in, we spent, I don't know, an afternoon talking over what we had read, what we liked, what we didn't like, what worked, what didn't work. And then ultimately, the the big takeaway that we came away from all of this was, if you want to write a bestseller, read bestsellers. These books were all from different genres, but they all ultimately had certain things in common that made them bestsellers. In fact, one of the things that one of the leaders of the workshop, Dean Wesley Smith, had said was that when uh, bestsellers are a genre unto themselves. So you might think of Nora Roberts as writing romance, but actually, no, she writes bestsellers. This is really obvious with some writers like Stephen King, whose books sometimes can be called horror, but sometimes they can be called science fiction, and sometimes they can be called crime and mystery stories, like recently his Bill Hodges trilogy, that kind of thing. I'm dropping a lot of names. If you're watching this video in 50 years, fill in the blanks with the names of popular authors in your day. But having done all of that, we then had, over the course of the next 2 weeks, a series of writing assignments. I think by the end of the 2 weeks, we had each written 5 short stories. We had put together a table of contents for a proposed anthology based upon the writings of everybody else who was in the group, which was a fascinating exercise. And we also had a meeting with an editor during the course of those 2 weeks. There was a lot going on, but each of the writing exercises emphasized something different. There were two in particular that were fascinating to me. One of the assignments was standard short story length, which is roughly 3 to 6,000 words. 3 to 5,000 words is better. Um, Write something you would never write. And at first I thought, oh, maybe they mean write in a genre that you wouldn't normally write. I very quickly realized, no, that wasn't the assignment. The assignment was to write something you are really uncomfortable writing. And that was a very difficult assignment for me because I took it at its word, and I wrote a story that I never ever ever would have written otherwise. Interestingly enough, it was in a genre that I don't write in, and the only reason I had an idea of how to write in that genre was because I read the year's best short stories in crime and mystery. And so I wrote a crime thriller, which I had never written up until that point. One of the assignments was to write a 10,000 word story. 10,000 word stories are very hard to sell in the publishing market. However, the this was the assignment. The assignment was, the thing about a story is it takes as long as it takes to tell the story. We had each been given a prompt, and I was given a prompt. It was an article from the New Yorker magazine or something like that, and it was one of these parents, a New York power couple who have a child, and the child had an imaginary friend, which is true of a lot of children. Only this child's imaginary friend, they always spoke on an invisible cell phone, and the child would report that, well, she couldn't get together with her imaginary friend because they were busy on a meeting, or they had another call, or they had a lot to do. The author of the article went to great pains to say this is the kind of thing that only could happen in New York City, where a child will have an imaginary friend who is too busy to play and is spending all their time on the cell phone. And I'm thinking to myself, first of all, not only in New York City, and second of all, you need to put down your cell phone and start playing with your child. But that's neither here nor there. I had an attitude about New York City at the time. And so, and I don't know if Chris knew that when she, this is Christine Catherine Rush, if she knew that when she gave me this article, but nonetheless, I decided I was going to write this humor piece about somebody whose imaginary friend comes back when they're an adult. I know this has been done as a couple different movies and all that, but this was going to be a comedy, and I was going to riff on this idea of how the imaginary friend kept calling to cancel appointments, that kind of thing. The thing is, we only had a few days, and I did not have any sort of a plot. Up until this point, I had always thought of myself as a plotter as opposed to a pantser. In writing circles, generally, people who write stories tend to think of themselves as either plotters or pantsers. They either work out the plot in great detail before they start writing, or they write by the seat of their pants, hence the term pantsers. They make it up as they go along. They don't necessarily know where it's going to go. Stephen King has famously said there's only one novel that he had plotted out ahead of time. He said this in his nonfiction book on writing. It's entirely possible he has plotted novels since then, but at the time, he said the only novel he had plotted was The Dead Zone. And he had very specific things he was trying to accomplish with this novel, which is why it had to have very specific scenes with very specific details. And so he plotted that whole thing out, and then he wrote it, and to great effect. It's a fantastic novel. All of the others were pantsers. All of the others started with a character who wanted something, and here's the scenario, go. I think this is one of the reasons why Stephen King's writing, whether or not he sticks the landing, usually reading his stories is very rewarding because the characters are so well drawn and the situations are so well drawn. That's because that's what he starts with. He starts with characters and situations. So, one of the instructions we had been given is if you find yourself in a situation where you are writing and you are stuck, you don't know what to do, trust the process. Just let it go, trust the process. And this is the first time in my writing life I've heard of writer's block, and there certainly have been times both before and since where I knew I wanted to write something, but I didn't know what, and so I didn't start writing for a long time. I've since experienced much stronger forms of writer's block, but on this particular occasion, I had my character and I had my situation, and I decided I was going to start this particular story in an airport for reasons. And a very specific airport, again, for reasons. It was definitely not going to be any airport near New York City. And after doing all of that, setting all of that up, I wrote the first paragraph. I was really, really happy with the first paragraph. The first paragraph evoked what I wanted to evoke. It had a very specific sense of place and anticipation. One character is waiting for another character to return from out of town, and as the returning character arrives, something is clearly off. Thought I had captured it beautifully, and I knew what I was going to do for the next paragraph, but I had no idea where this story was going to go. Interestingly enough, by the way, it ended up not being a comedy at all. Nothing comedic about this story. I actually ended up writing something that was almost a horror story. It certainly reads as a thriller up until you get near the end. And it reads like there might be supernatural elements, which is part of what makes a horror story. Is does it have supernatural elements? Does it elicit strong visceral response? Thrillers elicit strong visceral responses, but usually those responses are more of excitement than of disgust. The whole story here, the whole idea was to make you really uneasy about the situation. I didn't know that when I was starting. I thought I was writing a comedy, but each paragraph informed what the next paragraph was going to be. I wrote the second paragraph and I'm like, all right, I think I know what the next paragraph has to be, but once I get them out of the airport, I don't know what I'm going to do. Uh, oh, well, I guess I'll put them in a car. So, all right, I wrote the paragraph where they're going to the car. Well, now I don't know what to, oh, well, I guess he's going to take him to the hotel. So I never really knew at the beginning of this process what was going to what the next scene was going to be, but I did tend to know what the next paragraph was going to be. And I only had a few days to write this, and 10,000 words is a very, very long short story. It is verging on it's bordering into uh, novelette territory or novella territory. I can't remember which. The definitions are vague. The point is, 10,000 word stories, not something you read a lot of, but you do read from time to time. And I was not used to writing stories of that length. And I was desperately worried that I was going to end up coming up with, oh, I know what's happening in this story, and then I was going to finish it up, and and it was just going to be another 3 to 5,000 word story like I had always written. In fact, up until this workshop, almost every story that I had written came in at 3,500 words plus or minus 100. It was like clockwork. All of the stories that I'd written. This is the first one where the assignment was that won't be good enough. But that's fine. That means I have time to spend diving into these characters, giving them character moments, using the setting of the city where it was located. And I turned the city into a character itself. I went deep into the history of some of the buildings, and interestingly enough, as I was going through, I realized the details about the buildings were relevant to the rest of the story. Uh, and then I started introducing the elements of the imaginary friend. And I started with an actual phone call. Phone rings, person picks it up and puts it down, and it says, oh yeah, well, I need to meet with this character. And the other character recognizes, wait a minute, that's your childhood friend. What the hell is going on here? So, and I didn't know, as the writer, I had no idea where I was going with this, but I always knew where the next paragraph was going. And so, as nervous as I was about it, for the first time in my life, I thought about the words "trust the process." I didn't even know there was a process. It's not like Chris and Dean had told us what the process was. They just said, "Trust the process." And for me, the process was I'd write a paragraph and then I'd have an idea of what the next paragraph was. I had characters. Over time, I expanded the characters. I had the setting, and I expanded details about the setting. And then every once in a while, it occurred to me, time to bring in another really weird detail about this imaginary friend, and how is this imaginary friend manifesting in a real world. I at one point thought I might end up actually finishing this story up as a horror story. Here's the thing. I did trust the process. It was nerve-wracking, but I think in the end, one of the things that saved me was I had read so many stories up until that point. I had read so much horror, so much fantasy, so many crime stories, and I was a huge fan of movies and television shows that explored weird ideas that may or may not have real world explanations. The one that comes immediately to mind is the TV series The Twilight Zone. And the first few movies by director that were written and directed by M. Night Shyamalan. He wrote and directed the Sixth Sense. And I'm laughing because I, for a long time, I had a joke about how I was going to write a prequel called The Fifth Sense. I smell dead people. It's again, the tagline for The Sixth Sense was I see dead people. Anyway, uh, so having ingested all of this pop culture, I had internalized a sense of how stories unfold. And as I was moving forward, eventually I realized I didn't just know what the next paragraph was, I knew what the next scene was. I had to get from where we were to the next scene, and then in the next scene, I knew what I was going to do. Still didn't know what the scene after that was gonna be, but then when I got to the next scene, as I was developing it, I'm like, "Oh, of course, it makes sense that the next thing is going to be this." And I kept going. Every once in a while, I would scan what I had written up until that point, make sure everything was flowing, that I was keeping the pacing and all the rest of that. And then I don't know, I was maybe 4 or 5 scenes away. I had already written at some point I really caught, and I think I had written about 7,000 words when I realized what the ending of the story had to be. It just hit me. There's only one way this story could resolve itself, and it ended up not being a horror story. It ended up actually being very grounded in the real world. There was a very real explanation as to what had happened, and what it and but the thing is, all of these elements that led to the finale of the story came from elements of things that had happened in my real life, about how somebody had been tested for a medical diagnosis, and about how there was another incident that I remembered where you had two people talking in a car and it's raining heavily outside, and while they're talking, the windows in the car are kind of fogging up, and it was very atmospheric and all that. So there were so many elements that I was essentially pulling from things that had happened in my real life and also things that I had read. And I don't mean scenes that I had read, but I mean ideas that unfolded in a certain way. And then when I realized how the story had to end, I was able to write to that ending, and I felt like I wrapped it up fairly neatly. When all is said and done, I got I get okay. I did not quite hit my 10,000 word deadline. I did actually. I think I came in just under it. So, by the way, you don't count words when you're writing, but you do measure in terms of words. So you don't measure in terms of pages because the way you format the pages could end up the same document could end up being 20 pages long, or it could be 40 pages long, depending upon the fonts you choose and all the rest of that. So you go by your word processor's word count, and it's an approximation. But rather than hitting approximately 10,000 words, I hit approximately 9,000 words. I called it good enough. And it was good enough because we weren't being measured on those sorts of exact things. What the whole purpose of this assignment was to put us in a a a different band of short story. So most short stories are this length. This one was going to be longer, but it wasn't going to be long enough to be considered a novelette or a novella. Um, and because we were stretching our wings, we were stretching our capabilities. By the time I had finished this workshop, pardon me, the I came out of there with 5 stories that I felt really were sellable, and I did end up selling several of them. And the ones that I didn't sell, I still feel very good about. It's just that they don't yet have the market that is appropriate for them. Um, and that's okay. This was another important point that came out of the masterclass, and that was no writing is wasted if your intention is to be a writer. No story is wasted if your intention is to be a storyteller, because it's practice. You don't become a world-renowned cellist like Yo-Yo Ma without spending hours and hours and hours and hours practicing playing the cello alone where nobody can hear you. Those performances are lost the second you're done with them, but you have to go through the repetitions in order to develop the skills. The same thing is true with writing. The same thing is true with storytelling. If that, if the story that I had written for that 10,000 word exercise, if it ended up being a bad story, if it ended up being writing that didn't work, that's fine. It's practice. You learn from what you did the one time, and then next time you try to do something a little bit better. So I come out of this again, bringing us back to what I was saying at the beginning: garbage in, garbage out. If you read a lot of crap, you are not going to have excellent ideas floating around in your head about how an excellent story is constructed, but you're going to have a lot of crappy ideas about how crappy stories are put together. So if you want to write excellent stories, read excellent stories. If you or watch excellent stories as they are presented in television or movies or whatever the case may be, plays. If you want to write excellent songs, listen to excellent songs. And something that I discovered is it doesn't even matter what the genre is. I am in a band and we are recording originals, and I think you could probably describe our band as alt 70s country rock, because that's just sort of the sound that we have ended up producing with the 5 of us getting together, with our own experiences and all that. I've listened to a lot more music than music from the 70s, that's kind of inspired by the Rolling Stones. Um, and yet that's sort of the sound that we've come out with. Doesn't matter. I know what a good song sounds like. I know what a crappy song sounds like. And because I can tell the difference, I believe that my contributions to our band and to our songs have, and this is true of everybody in the band, have contributed to making the songs as good as they can be, given the limitations of our own abilities as musicians. So so that's my thought of the day, my tip of the day. If you want to be an excellent storyteller, you got to read, or expose yourself to excellent stories. And at the same time, you have to learn to trust the process. At the end of the day, your process might be you can't write anything unless you plot it out, and that's totally fine. Your process will end up being your process, but if you want to make things happen, sometimes you're just going to have to let go and trust the process. Thanks for listening to my story about writing a story, and we'll talk more. If you have any questions about this particular story or story writing in general, be sure to mention it in the comments. And we'll see you again next time. Have a good one.